That's a perfect example of why we do what we do. It's about understanding and context and building connection with the human experience because that's the
Right.
only time that you can start to discover the real truth.
Hmm.
It's not a coincidence, I think, that your podcast is Truth Be Found because people think defense lawyers are about manipulating the truth or trying to get it off on a technicality. There's so many deeper truths, and the real truth of our system is that the people who are involved in law enforcement, starting with the police, moving to the prosecutors, and ultimately the judges, are often very just concrete black and white thinkers. Well, the law says this, and you did this, so you get this punishment.
Hmm.
And our job is not about the black and white. There are nuances, there are shades of gray in the
Hmm.
human story, in the human truth, and our job is to take those gray areas and bring them into living color. Over 1 million Americans face sentencing every year, and it will be the most important day of their lives. But we don't fully understand the system, how broken it is, and what we can do to make it better. I'm Doug Passon. I'm a 25-year criminal defense lawyer and a sentencing expert. My goal is to bring more awareness, more fairness, and more humanity to the sentencing process. So, are you ready? Then let's get set for sentencing. Hey everybody, Doug Passon coming to you from Studio 3553 in Scottsdale, Arizona. Today I have an incredible guest on set for sentencing. I believe it is the first time I have ever had an investigator on my show. I've had mitigation specialists and lawyer after lawyer after lawyer and law professors, probation officers, but never an investigator. And they are
Oh,
so gosh darn important to what we do. So I don't know why it took me almost 100 episodes to have an investigator, but not only do I have an investigator, I would say I have the investigator, one of the very, very finest at the top of his profession. Welcome to Set for Sentencing, Justin Yentes. I pronounce that wrong? Is it Yentes or Yentes?
it's Yentis, the latter.
Yentes. Well, you know what I
Yes.
love about that? Sorry. So I pronounced your name wrong. And which is pretty sad because I've known you for like 20 years. Um,
Right.
but you but
That's okay.
I'll never forget it because I don't know if you're a Fiddler on the Roof fan, but one of
Oh
the
yeah,
characters there is Yenta
the
and
Yenta.
the Yenta. So now I'm just gonna call you the Yenta. The
I,
Yentas.
I've been
Um
hearing that for a long time.
well, she was a very important character. She was the matchmaker.
Uh-huh, exactly.
Uh-huh. So
I
Justin,
remember the song.
I'm gonna talk about you for a second so our listeners know exactly what kind of a roller coaster ride we're getting ready to take here. But Justin
Okay.
Yentis is a long time investigator. I would say maybe primarily in the field of criminal investigations, but that's because those are all my dealings with him. But his work goes well beyond that into the civil world, into the political world. Justin also, here's what's cool. He has a new awesome podcast of his own called Truth Be Found. And I wanted to read the description for that because I hope that, one of the takeaways is to go check that podcast out because it's really cool. And I'm not just saying that because I was your first guest, but
You were, you were.
that
We were great.
was
We were grateful to have you.
well, I was grateful to be had. That was a huge honor. So this is kind of like quid pro quo, Clarice. I wanted you to come on my podcast and keep going with the great conversation that we had a few weeks back. But here's what Truth Be Found is. Truth Be Found is not your average podcast. It's a thrilling journey into the heart of investigation with your host, Justin Yentes. Join Justin as he dives deep into the world of high stakes investigations, interviewing colleagues and experts who have ventured into the jungles and beyond to discover the truth. From researchers and attorneys to digital forensics experts, Delta Force and SEAL Team 6, each episode offers a captivating glimpse into the minds of those who seek truth in the most complex cases. So that is a really cool podcast, and I have a really cool guest. So thank you again for being here.
Thanks
And
for having
let's
me.
just dig in. This thing about the jungles is it's I'm hearkening back to an episode, and I don't mean a podcast episode. I mean an event. And I must admit it's a little foggy in my mind. So I want you to tell this story because really I just need my memory refreshed. We're gonna flash back to I think it was like a year and a half, 2 years ago. My recollection is I was on vacation. I was in Oregon. I think I was there to see The Boss with two of my buddies, but it was a
Hmm.
Friday night and we had just had a lovely meal, and there admittedly were copious amounts of tequila involved. And and by the way, I remember very specifically what tequila we were drinking because it's my all-time favorite. It's Fortaleza.
Okay.
And I always love to, well, you may not know this, but I always like to weave in tequila recommendations into my podcast. There's no bigger, better, more awesome tequila recommendation that I could ever make in this lifetime than Fortaleza.
And
It's off.
Fortaleza, I will check that
Yes.
out.
Yeah, now it's very hard to get because the secret is out. It's as authentic as you can get. It's smooth, it's delicious, the price is right. Most experts will tell you it is absolutely the best tequila you could ever get. So, but
Nice.
because it's like small batch and artisan, they can't mass produce it, so it's a little hard to find.
And
I
where is it produced? In
well,
Chihuahua or?
that's a good question. All tequila is produced in one of five regions in Mexico. I can't remember offhand where Fortaleza is. I will have to look that up. But so yeah, maybe the next time you're down there, you can just visit the distillery and bring
Right,
me back
exactly.
some. But you know what
I'd
I
be happy
love?
to.
Not only do I love to make tequila recommendations, but I love to make them relevant to the guest or the topic. And I just feel like Fortaleza, top of their game, authentic as you can get, smooth, delicious, reputation for being the very finest. That's you, man. I
Well,
mean,
I
you are the
appreciate that.
Fortaleza. You are the Fortaleza of investigation. So anyway, I'm with my buddies drinking Fortaleza. A call comes in. I ordinarily wouldn't answer it, but when Justin's name comes up on the caller ID, I pick up. So
I appreciate that.
and you were way in, I don't know if you were in the jungle, but you were way, so tell me where you were, what you were
I
doing,
was
and more importantly, why did you
adjacent
call
to
me? I
it.
forgot.
So I was outside of a hotel in southern El Salvador, and
What were you doing there outside a
I
hotel in
had
southern El Salvador?
I'd gone down there with a lady by the name of Rebecca Lichtenfeld, and she is a documentary filmmaker out of Brooklyn. And she and I went to El Salvador to document and investigate the life history of one of our clients who was from that region. So, as the reason I called you is because you have forged the way in the video presentations of life histories and sentencing mitigation, and have always been a mentor to me in that realm. And so when Rebecca and I had some questions on how to elicit some responses in a good manner that was within the confines of of the law and keeping in consideration discovery and disclosure and whatnot. So I called you out to get some advice on that. So
Okay.
Rebecca was recruited by uh, Liz Varkesian's group,
Oh yeah.
ARC, out of
Yep.
throughout of Baltimore,
Yeah.
and was brought
Not,
on
by the
to.
way, footnote, she was my first guest on the
She
podcast.
was, and
Yeah.
she was just a repeat guest, if I
Yep.
remember
I had
correctly.
her on
Yeah,
for setting mitigation standards for non-capital cases. But
which
yeah,
is
okay.
a fantastic episode.
I guess
So,
I'm left wondering why Liz didn't hire me to go do this, but I guess I'm probably happy I didn't have to go to El Salvador. I'm
and
scared to go to
honestly,
those places.
it wasn't originally set to be a video sentencing trip.
Hmm.
But Rebecca was brought on as a an assistant mitigation specialist because she had a lot of history working in Central and South America with political unrest. She was an investigator for the Truth Commission, documenting war crimes in various countries that had experienced civil unrest and civil war. So she came on to help put together the history from kind of a sociological standpoint and build a strong relationship with our client who was housed in a prison in Brooklyn.
Mm,
So then when we were preparing our presentation to send to DC to determine whether or not the feds were going to seek the death penalty, I started bringing up, well, Doug had done this great video in Travis's case, and I showed her some of the work that you had done in that case. And so we discussed, well, how do we create a video in this case? And we didn't think we were going to get the feds to bring on a third person. So she said, well, why don't I take a crack at it? And
nice.
she put together a lot of documentaries that have done very well. She was a nominee for an Oscar this past award
What?
ceremony. Yeah, yeah,
What
she's
movie? Do
fantastic.
you know what the movie
It,
was?
I don't, off the
Mm,
top of my head, it was something about Alzheimer's.
okay. I gotta get her on the podcast.
Oh yeah,
I
she's
love
she's
talking to filmmakers,
incredible. Hmm.
storytellers. So
Well,
what?
and
So this
oh,
was a
go ahead.
dangerous spot, right? I mean, like this is what people don't understand, especially about investigators when you have to go to various places in the country or out of the country. It's serious business a lot of times. Like it's dangerous,
Oh
scary.
yeah, oh
This
yeah.
was one of those spots, I assume.
It was. So if folks have been paying attention to the news internationally, El Salvador in the last, I'd say, 20 years or so, has really experienced a huge uptick in the amount of gang activity. And primarily that is dominated by MS-13 and another group called excuse me, it's MS-13 and one called Barrio 18, which is 18th Street.
Hmm.
And those two gangs are the predominant forces of control or have been for quite a while. Now, a couple of years ago, their new president, Nayib Bukele, enforced what he's referring to as the state of exception. It has been a total lift or suspension of their constitution so that people could be incarcerated and the due process rights could be streamlined, which as a criminal defense attorney, I'm sure that raises the hair on the back of your neck to
Yeah.
hear streamlined due process.
Right.
Um, but after doing that, he rounded up and incarcerated just tens of thousands of people, some who are active gang members, some who are former gang members, and some who are associated with them or family members of them. In fact, several people have been incarcerated and then found to not have been guilty of a crime or not be associated or and then they've ended up being released. And this is a concept called ex post facto in the U.S. system of government, where you create a law and then charge someone for something that
Hmm.
happened before the creation of that law, and that's
Hmm.
exactly what's going on in El Salvador. So all
Wow.
that to say, a lot of the gang activity has been hindered for the moment while this state of exception is in place. So we were there during that time, and there were a lot of police patrols. There are things that are illegal to say. You can't wear a shirt that has certain colors, certain numbers. You can't
Wow.
even speak the names of the gangs without being in fear of incarceration, investigation, or further harassment by the government.
And so you're walking around with presumably like with a camera in hand. Is that something that's gonna put you on the radar as well?
Well, I I don't I don't know. I
Yeah.
got out, I can tell you that, and I've been a couple of
Yeah.
times, and I've been in and around some pretty heavily gang infested and affected areas, and you can see that the people are very hesitant to talk. I mean, number one, I'm a I'm a big guy. I'm 6'6", and obviously I don't fit in Central America that well. So I stand out as is. But then when you start talking about, gang activity, and you're a big white guy that's coming through, one of these towns in the country, it does raise eyebrows.
Mm-hmm.
So I have to be always aware of the situation and aware of who's listening and aware of what's going on around me and
Yeah.
make decisions that way.
And so you're down there, you said to do like a life history investigation, but you're taking video. So I guess my first question would be for someone who's kind of uninitiated to the process, what is a life history and why would you be doing that in a death penalty in a case to convince the decision makers not to put death on the table? What's the point
Sure.
there?
So in the federal system, the feds will let a defense team know that they are considering the death penalty, or that this case that you're working on is going to be reviewed by the Department of Justice to determine whether or not they want to pursue the death penalty. Now, before that happens, before they make that decision, they will take in all of the information that we want to present to them, to make our case that our client deserves life, or that he is undeserving of the death penalty, or that they're unlikely to get a death verdict in a trial. It's our first chance to present to the government our arguments for sparing a defendant's life. And
Mhm.
so we were collecting video and testimony and evidence and witnesses that could help in that process.
Excellent. And, I think part of this is probably just proximity of witnesses. In other words, there are people, real live human beings that have something to add to the story that you can't necessarily bring into the country or have testify or present them to the government. So taking a witness statement is important. But beyond that, this is about visual storytelling. And I think this is the sort of passion that you and I, not sort of, definitely, that we share the idea that, the idea of immersive storytelling. It's not just about
Mm-hmm.
putting a camera, sitting a witness on a couch and turning on the camera and having them say stuff. You're clearly there to, you know, you can't bring El Salvador to the government. You need to bring the government to El Salvador, and they're not on this trip with you.
Mm-hmm.
So I assume you're doing a whole lot of other things in terms of the visual picture that you're trying to paint about what life is like growing up in a place like this.
Right, exactly. And for me, I'd never been to the country. I've lived in South America, and I've worked extensively in Mexico, but El Salvador is a country that I'd never visited. So if I'm going to be able to accurately and authentically tell anyone what life was like growing up there, I'm going to have to go to those areas and meet the people, and walk the streets and see where crimes happened, and see where Civil War atrocities occurred, and capture that in whatever way I can, so that who's ever going to be experiencing this information can experience it in the most immersive way possible. So I've always thought that the more senses that we could bring into the conversation, the better. Because reading a report is one thing, and I've got a couple pages of a report here, and if I pass this to you, you could download the information and understand it. But if you could go along with me and meet the person I interviewed, and sit in the house that I sat in, and see the homemade furniture made out of tires, and see the kids running around in this area, and hear a mom tell me about a homicide that happened literally outside their front door, and show you the wall where someone was brutally assassinated by a gang, and experiencing the full story. It's something that can't be conveyed, or it's a heck of a lot more difficult to convey via the written word alone.
Yeah.
Jen Wilmot and I, and we're down in southern Mexico, and we were at a very impoverished house where there was a makeshift toilet that had been moved around the yard, and when it would fill up, they'd cover it up with some dirt and move it to a new location. And we kept saying to each other, like, how is it that we could get the jury to understand and feel the humidity and have the mosquitoes and the smell of feces and explain to them this is where this little boy grew up. So they are experiencing an upbringing that's so different than what I might have experienced in Tempe, Arizona,
Yeah.
or you might have experienced in Scottsdale, or wherever. I don't know where actually where you were a child, but it's something that can only be lived or shared with as much creativity as you possibly can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you are using, this is another thing I love about you. So in order to sort of engage those senses, well, you remember that, I don't know if you knew this, back in the day they had like smellorama or smell-o-vision at the movie theaters
Exactly.
where they'd
We've
pump
talked
some
about
sort
that.
of scent in.
Yeah.
Like we can't I haven't figured out a way to do that, but that would have been probably pretty good for your roving toilet video. Um,
Totally. Disneyland, I think, has some new flyover deal where they shoot scents at you, and they
uh-huh.
have 3D video going on in front of you, and you're in a chair. And, ideally, that would be what we could do, but we are limited somewhat in what a judge will allow us to do, and I think having a jury sent to Disneyland for a custom experience like that might be asking a little much.
Well, you could like bring a briefcase to the settlement conference, play the video, and just have like 7 weeks of rotted fruit in your briefcase or something, and open it up at the right time. I don't know
That's
if you could pull that off, the smell-o-vision aspect, you would be my all-time hero of heroes. But
I will
we
work
don't do
on that.
that, but we do other outside the box techniques, especially, when I started, what really got me started in the move in making videos in my cases for clients, which is now around 2005, I think, is my first one. So I'm 20 years down the road, but it was just how the technology had started to evolve. Like I had been
Hmm.
doing things with movies and everything else, but it was just on the cusp of digital video, and is even before we all had these amazing video cameras we're all walking around with now on our phones. So there's just more and more technology, and cheap, like easier to obtain. My first drone I spent well over $1,000 on, and I have one that's 10 times better that cost me three or $400. So you tell me some of the stuff, and then we're on the YouTubes. So for people who are interested in this, we're gonna see some examples. I got a couple. I know you got a couple, but you're talking about engaging some pretty interesting outside the box visual techniques just beyond the straight shot video. What are you doing?
Right. So recently, I got into the drone space, and I got the idea actually in El Salvador because one of the guys that we were working with, who was a local video guy, he was a local investigative journalist.
Hmm?
He had a drone, and he brought it out, and he was taking overhead shots of these different jungle areas, and just experiencing what emotions and my own reaction to his work kind of convinced me that this needed to be a standard in everything that we do.
Yeah.
That it brought so much more perspective to the scene, and so I think I purchased a drone within a week of getting back, a DJI Mini Pro 3, I think.
I got
And
I think I have the two, like but I got it at Costco, the whole bundle. That was my
mhm,
second drone. My first one was one of the original. It was called a 3DR Solo or something. It was really nice, but it was big, honking, terrible battery life, very loud, super obtrusive. This little
mhm.
DJI, I was just flying my little DJI Mini the other day because there was something on my roof that was making noise. We thought we had an animal on the roof, so I'm like, well, let's fly the drone up there. But like it's so quiet, I couldn't even see the
Right,
thing, which is
right.
probably pretty handy if you're in El Salvador. But do you have an example of when? Well, do you have any? Let's see if we can pull up. We can do a screen share
Sure.
I'll show you yours if you show me mine. No,
You
but
bet.
set it up like why? Because here is the truth of the filmmaking process. We have to be careful that we don't get too cute in the
Right.
process. In other words, this isn't about being Hollywood flashy. And I actually get annoyed by some documentaries that do this overuse of drone, these ubiquitous drones sweeping over the neighborhood. Why are they doing that? Because they can. Because
Hmm.
it's like I said, it's cheap now. You don't have to pay for a helicopter to take overhead shots. So just because you can does not mean you
Doesn't mean you
should.
should.
So give me an example. You mentioned the jungle overhead. So what would be a good reason to? Because I always say you have why is the most important word in our filmmaking process. Why?
Right.
Why are we doing this? Why are we interviewing this witness? Why are we asking this question? Why are we filming them in this spot? Why are we using a drone? You know,
Sure.
why? And there has to be a really good reason. So set that up and then show me a little clip there.
Sure. So one of my recent cases involved a homicide that happened in northern Arizona. And actually, I haven't been back to Mexico or El Salvador since I picked up my drone. But in this is a case that happened in Prescott, and our client was alleged to have uh, murdered his wife and taken her body out into a wash in kind of the middle of what they claimed was the middle of nowhere. And their arguments were that our client had gone out to this area before because they had tracked his phone and had made plans ahead of time. Now, as it turns out, this was a very popular shooting location, and it was very close to where the homicide happened. So recreational shooters would go out there and shoot rifles and handguns and whatnot. And there was a big open field, and it just happened to be next to this wash. So putting the scene in perspective became important for us
Mhm.
to show how this actually went down. So this is part of the video that I ended up taking, and I'll skip to the the
Nice.
better part. So I'm not a great drone operator, but you can see where the two trucks are there. One of those is a vehicle that I was using, and the other just happens to be a shooter that was out in the area.
Nice.
And so I did a flyover of this area, and then I'll speed it up a little so we can kind of cut to the chase, as they say, and then drove down the road and showed how where the scene was in relation to that shooting range. Um, so obviously this isn't Hollywood quality,
Which
but
is okay. It does
you
not
can
need to
see
be.
where how you would get to the scene from the shooting scene. Actually filmed us driving down this road between the scene and the wash. So the
Mhm.
wash is just down this road. Um, so then once I got to the wash, which is just on this curve, then I went to the burial site and took some overhead shots so that the jury would understand with more clarity what had happened. Because it's very hard to explain with just a map. Now they can,
Yeah.
they'd be sent back in the jury room with this, and they could look around and look at the area and see, the distance and see if it was realistic in their mind.
Right, right, right. I love it. And
So,
there are some standard things that I think, so you don't work per se for a public defender office. You're private, but you do a lot of court appointed work and you do a lot of private work. And I think there's a misconception that you have to have a lot of resources and spend a lot of money to get something like this. And when I talk to the public defender's office, I'm like, you should just have everybody should just have a freaking drone
mhm.
at their disposal. Why not?
Oh yeah.
It costs nothing. They're so super easy to fly. Well, let me show you mine. I've done them in a bunch of cases too. Um, but this one is kind of my one of my favorites, and it was a death penalty case. And again, we're doing kind of life story work, and I was down in Louisiana and filming the childhood home where they grew up. But part of the story was dad was never around.
Hmm.
It's a common story, but here's what made it a little uncommon, which is dad was incarcerated, sometimes a common story too, but dad was incarcerated in a jail that was basically behind the woods of the house that he grew up in. So his
Wow.
father was so close, but so far away for his whole life.
Hmm.
And kind of growing up knowing that there's this jail over yonder and my dad is there.
Hmm.
And that in and of itself is kind of a wow moment, but I'm like, well, let's kind of see, So and I said, well, you know, the drone is what would help us really put that into perspective. Now, I could have done a one-dimensional, maybe a Google Earth shot with a little red line, here's the jail and here's the house, but this is definitely more immersive way to do it, right?
Oh
Um,
yeah,
can you see this?
I can.
Yeah, so and it's a simple shot, it's a minute long, and we start the drone right at the house and you see there's woods. I'm kind of narrating for people who want, and there's a little patch of woods, and we just rise up over the woods, and the moment we get over this little tree line, it can't be more than a block or two long.
Oh
um,
wow.
the correctional facility comes into view. It's a massive,
Wow.
massive, sprawling correctional facility. And so he and his father were essentially next door neighbors in the most bizarre, traumatic, horrible way you could imagine as a child,
Wow,
right?
that's incredible.
And so it's a pretty powerful way of putting somebody in the moment. And
And
so,
without this shot, I mean, it'd be very difficult to explain the reality
yeah,
of what this kid experienced growing up.
yeah, that's the full flavor of it. So you have done some 360 degree, like full on VR type filming too, I'm told. Is that right?
Well, well, we're getting that up and running. So I've I've been looking at a lot of different vendors for these 3D the Leica scanners.
Mm-hmm.
There's several different variations of them and at various price points. And what I'm trying to put together is how we can take a scanner into an area and scan for a 3D replica of this scene or this
Uh-huh.
environment, and then put that into a VR headset. Now, this is
Uh-huh.
somewhat untested as far as I know, but I would like a jury or a judge to rather to allow me to put a jury into a virtual reality headset
Yes.
and walk the streets of southern Mexico with me.
Yes.
Now, I've not had success with that yet,
Have
but
you
but
tried? Have you asked, like, you mean you haven't had success in the with the technology or with getting a judge to agree to let you do something like that?
well, we've I've got a couple of potential cases that we could use it for,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm still kind of developing the process right now. But ideally, if we're trying to bring our jurors into as much of the scene as possible, like I felt like that was the next step in doing
Yes.
so.
Oh my gosh, I've thought about that too. I've never tried to do it myself in terms of getting a jury or decision maker to strap on a VR headset.
Right,
But there's
right.
nothing more immersive than that when you can turn your head, look this way, look up, look down.
Hmm.
And I will tell you, great minds do think alike, though, because I have dabbled in the 360-degree filming. And
Hmm.
I don't know if GoPro's still making this, but they came out with one of the original 3D cameras.
Hmm.
And I had a accident scene that I wanted to shoot. It was more just to kind of play and experiment with it. And I didn't buy the thing, but there's companies you can rent for a day or two. And so it costs
Right.
nothing to do. But I'll just I can share that one too, because I mean, it's nothing extraordinary. Again, it doesn't have to be super Hollywood. And this is I uploaded this to Vimeo. Can you see this?
I can.
Yeah, and so when you play that, nothing much is happening, but the cool part is you can just
Oh yeah.
you can just manipulate it so you can get a 360 up, down, all around. So I'm standing in the middle of the intersection there, basically,
Hmm.
and you can move it. You can see everywhere, all around, up and down.
Oh, that's
And
great.
so, and that's, that camera itself was not, like I said, I don't know if they're still making those, but I'm hoping they are, but the camera itself was not super expensive. Um, but as I said, you could rent it. You didn't even have to buy it.
Yeah, and that's what I was looking at for the 3D scanners is going into a rental agreement because the buying a scanner standalone and owning it is
Very
10
expensive.
10 plus $1,000, and
Yeah,
you gotta use the heck out of that to make up that investment.
right. And the other thing on the subject of GoPro is that is for, I don't know if you use GoPro or something like it, but in my opinion, that's something every investigator should have in their little
Hmm.
toolbox.
Oh
And
yeah.
the reason is because, well, there's a few reasons, but I think the biggest reason is it's very unobtrusive.
Hmm.
So, like, you can stick a GoPro on the outside of your car with a suction mount and drive
Exactly.
through the most crime-ridden area in town, and most people wouldn't even notice that you were
Hmm.
filming. So it's a safety
Exactly.
thing.
Right.
Yeah. And the other thing I love about it is they keep coming with each iteration of the GoPro, they do better and better with image stabilization.
Hmm.
Because GoPro, obviously, you're moving, so there could be that shaky camera is one thing I always tell lawyers, like, you can't have a shaky camera because you're just going to distract the audience and make them sick, and then
Right.
they're not watching your story. But
Exactly.
that's, I mean, you could be driving or whatever, and it's so smooth. And the other thing I love about it is it does really well in low light. So a lot of
Hmm.
times we need to be at the scene of a crime or something because crimes happen at night,
They
and
do.
it's hard to film in low light. But I have one more. I don't want to like make this about me, but I'm going to show you one clip because and this was many years ago. So this is a GoPro Hero 5.
Okay.
So they're up to a Hero 10 by now. So they're
Oh
like
wow.
5, 6 iterations down the road. And so the image stabilization with that was pretty good, but now it's like a million times better. And again, it's something you can pick up at Costco for a couple $100. But this was just bad neighborhood at night with a suction cup mount on the side of a car. And
Wow, that's fantastic.
cars moving, the lighting is great, the image is smooth.
Hmm.
I didn't do any stabilization in post or anything like that. There's two cop cars. So, I mean, the point is there's so many easy, cheap techniques that we can use to bring this story to life. And
Hmm.
we're in a golden age of
Right.
criminal defense and investigations, and you're at the front of it. So, what else should we talk about? We could go on and on and on, but I think it would be helpful at this point to because I'm the lawyer and lawyers cannot survive and thrive and win without the team in place. But
This
we
is
are
true.
often really bad at managing the team and being the leadership. I always say lawyering is leadership.
Oh, it
And
totally
so
is.
so
You're the quarterback.
when ideally, yeah, the lawyer is the quarterback. And one of my biggest
Hmm.
pet peeves, especially with video stuff, especially because a lot of lawyers don't know much about making it, they'll just say, "Well, go make a video." You know,
Hmm.
I'm like, well, let's talk about this. What's the narrative? What are we trying to prove? What do you think is going to move the needle with this judge or this decision maker? And then let's go make a movie, right?
Right.
But ideally, the lawyer is the quarterback and they're leading, and so turn-ons and turn-offs, like I, back in the day, remember the Playboy or do you ever see Caddyshack?
Oh yeah.
I enjoy skinny skiing and going to bullfights on acid. What do you enjoy when you work with a lawyer, or maybe more more appropriately, what do you not enjoy when lawyers engage you in a case? What do you need from us so that you can do your job well?
So I think that the most important aspect of a good relationship between an attorney and their experts or their defense team is communication. And I've got a couple of defense teams that I communicate with on a daily basis. And these are cases that have gone on for obviously years for a death penalty case. And we're still talking on a daily basis about different witness issues, different evidentiary issues that I'm turning up, motions and whatnot that the attorneys are doing, and so it keeps us all on the same page and in sync. When there's a communication breakdown, the team goes to hell really quickly.
Yeah.
When the lawyers sometimes, in capital cases, obviously there are two attorneys. Well, it's obvious to us, might not be obvious to everyone. There's two attorneys on the case. There have been times when those two attorneys will talk back and forth. They'll talk to the prosecutor. They don't convey the message to the rest of the team, and so we're still off going, going 100 miles an hour towards one resolution, and they've already made a decision to change that course without communicating it to anyone else.
Hmm.
So that has happened multiple times. I like attorneys that give us all of the information that they have. And I've had a few lawyers that we've worked for that say, like, I've got this big homicide case. Here's 2 pages of the report. This is all you need. And please go and do XYZ on based on these 2 pages. And oftentimes we're left out of the full scope of a case in those situations, and it hinders the work that we do because we're trained and have experience in looking for our own questions, developing our own theories, and presenting those back, looking for strengths and weaknesses, not only in one task that we're working on, but kind of all of the tasks. And so when we have a limited scope, a limited amount of data to go on, our ability to be completely effective is hindered. What I really do like are attorneys that will think outside the box. And I don't know, that's somewhat cliche, but looking at a case and saying, it doesn't matter if it's been tried before. What if we try it? What if we try and show a video in this stage of the case? And what if we try and bring in this type of expert and explain an issue in a new and exciting way that the jury is really going to connect with? And it might not be in the standard playbook of defense work, but that's how innovation happens, and that's how the game has changed. And just like how you changed it in early 2000s, starting to do videos. And I've seen videos in various places around the country now, but I've always felt that your work in the Phoenix Federal Defender's Office was what started that whole wave. And if it wasn't for guys like you and your passion for doing this, no one would be doing videos right now, or maybe they wouldn't be as good, or we'd be several
Oh,
years behind.
I appreciate
So,
that. I love that. And, we should talk about one of these cases. But, well, first of all, communication is, I agree so much. I mean, I have to say, I'm working on a case right now. I don't believe I've ever spoken to the lawyer in the case.
wow.
There's a really wonderful mitigation specialist who's been my point person and easy to work with. Great. Love her to death, but it's a red flag when the lawyer is
Hmm.
nowhere to be found.
Oh, totally.
And that is, and in capital cases, I think there's actually an ethical requirement that they have regular team meetings.
Hmm.
So the good capital lawyers, you're basically getting the whole team together regularly, weekly, bi-weekly, monthly at the latest, and everyone's on the same page. And then, there's tech is our friend for that too, because there's a million ways to stay connected
Oh
now.
yeah,
I mean, a basic email chain, but I think you use Basecamp. Is
we
my
do.
recollection. So
Hmm.
Basecamp is just a one-stop shop for everybody having access to everything and being on the same page.
Right. Yeah,
Clearly,
we
that's
use
a
that.
priority for you.
we use that excuse me, extensively. We
Yeah.
use Google Drive extensively in the these are in the professional paid settings,
Mhm.
and they have higher security standards for the ones
Yeah.
that we're implementing, multiple
I have
factor
a lawyer
authentication and
friend.
whatnot.
So that's a great pointer. And you mentioned when you talk about not getting the full info, I can't think of a greater cardinal sin for a lawyer to send out somebody when they don't know everything they need to know.
Right. Well, in their
Information is our
defense,
currency.
it is. And there's two different types of investigators in the criminal defense realm. And they're often referred to as a comprehensive investigator or a task-oriented investigator. So in some of the offices, the government offices, the public defense offices and whatnot, they won't have a necessarily an assigned investigator for every case. Instead, they'll have a general request form where they can send in a request, and their investigations department will go and fulfill that request. And so the attorney may, and I don't know which offices are doing this now, but I've had complaints about this from folks over the years. But an investigator will get a sheet that says, you need to talk to this person and ask them these three questions, and they know nothing about the case, but they're supposed to go out and talk to this one person and ask these three questions, and they can't develop anything on their own. So in that sense, it can be just kind of gopher work. Um, a comprehensive investigator is going to go through the entire case file and look for what they think is a strength and is a weakness in the case, look for their forensic angles, look for what witnesses were overlooked, which ones were asked the wrong questions, which ones have credibility issues. And then that creates a much more robust discussion with the team, because now you've got a person that's not necessarily a strict defender, a defense attorney that is looking at something with a different set of eyes.
Hmm.
So those conversations then, in my opinion, become a lot more fruitful because the attorneys are learning from a different perspective of avenues that they could take. And sometimes they shut those down, and sometimes they are very excited about them, but at least the conversation is had, and our attorneys bring us great ideas and we bring them great ideas, and that makes a great synergistic relationship.
Well, I always say that these witness interviews, at least when we do them for the mitigation videos, is it's about getting everything that you want and nothing that you don't,
Mm-hmm.
especially because you're recording this stuff. But the only way you can guarantee that is by having as much information as you can have about who this person is, what you think they're going to say, what other bad facts are out there that you need to deal with or not deal with in an interview or just put to the side, whatever it is. But I just think that it's a recipe for disaster to send somebody out half baked like that. So
Oh, it
hopefully that
totally
doesn't
is.
happen too often. Do you have
I hope not.
before we move on to maybe like our next to last topic, but are there any other do's and don'ts, turnoffs, anything else that you had ready to drop pearly
You
drops
know,
of wisdom? Those are huge ones, to
yeah,
be
yeah.
sure.
I think it's just important to have an attorney take everything into consideration that your team members are bringing to the table. I've got a case right now, for example, where the team has been having a discussion about a self-defense argument. And I'm one that I've grown up around firearms and taken classes with the NRA and worked with force investigations and use of force issues. So I've got a lot of experience in the use of force and the disparity of force between two people that can justify the use of deadly force. Um, so in these conversations, you know, while many people on the team might have a perception of what is justified self-defense, like having the full scope of what is justified is very important if we're going to start raising this issue. And so, we've had our team meetings, and I brought in some of the case law on Carpenter and other cases that show when force can be used, And luckily I work with great attorneys that are very receptive to my research, and then they do their own and come up with a resolution. But having folks that will listen to the experience of all of the team members is super important. And it's great to have a diverse team, because if you've got five people on your team that are identical to Doug Passon, then you're going to hear yourself repeated five times, which
Right.
your wife might
There's
enjoy or
it's
might not like. But
she wouldn't
but
like that. Trust me. She would not like that.
right, but it
She's
benefits
has her
you.
hands full with
Right,
one version of Doug.
but it benefits you to have a lot of good ideas to choose from, and a lot of
It
perspectives that
does.
you can bring into your decision making.
And it benefits me to have people tell me how up my own ass I am
Hmm.
in a particular issue. In other words, I think sometimes people just want to defer because, oh, they're the lawyer and they must know something more than I do or whatever. No, if
Hmm.
you think your lawyer's full of shit, which I have been known to be on occasion, you have to. That's what we need. It's like team of rivals. You need somebody to be able to say, no, no, stop. Listen to what I'm saying now. Let me take you through it one step at a time and show
Hmm.
you why I don't think you're right about this. I think you're wrong. And
Right.
a good lawyer is not going to be put off by that. A good lawyer is going to actually appreciate that if it's done delicately, right? But
Right.
because we are we are ego driven people, and
So we're
we
investigators.
love to be the smartest person in the room, or at least think that we are, and we aren't all the time, not so.
Hmm.
Um, I would
But
say
we
that,
all and we
yeah,
all have our specialties. A mitigation specialist. I work with Dr. Alan Ellis quite a bit, and Alan, and
yeah,
he can go in and talk to a family in a way that is just endearing, and it's like watching a Hallmark movie. And I don't know how he does it, but
yeah,
he's got the most calming, inviting, gentle, loving
yeah.
presence
Sweet
of
soul.
about anyone I've ever met. And 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 bringing him into a situation is just invaluable. We've got another case right now where we're defending a victim of polygamy, and this is not just a couple of consenting adults, with the upside down pineapple swingers clubs and whatnot, but it's some
Whoa,
people.
what? Ooh, that's a whole other podcast. Upside
Well, it
down
is
pineapple.
apparently it's a sign for swingers. If you're at a hotel or a resort, there's an upside down pineapple, and that's how you know that other swingers are there. I only
Okay.
learned this because, for the record, I only learned this because we were studying polygamy and these alternate
Is that is
lifestyles.
that a picture of a pineapple or is it actually a living, breathing pineapple
I
upside
think it
down?
could be either one.
Either. Okay. Now, I had heard tell, we were getting way off topic, but in some, supposedly, this could be urban legend, but in some fancy neighborhoods, there's blue rocks, like you'll paint a rock blue, and that's supposedly the sign that there's swinging going on there.
I've heard that about a neighborhood in Gilbert as well, that
Oh
it's
my.
full of swingers. I don't know if it's true, but that's the
Oh,
rumor. But for example, like with that woman she was one of the women who, when Warren Jeffs, the FLDS leader, was
yeah.
imprisoned,
Yeah.
other men stepped up and said, "I'm the new prophet." And so these men would then marry multiple women, because that is, in their religion is what God has told them to do. And some of them are underage, some of them they're bringing across state lines. So it became a federal offense. All that to say, that woman would not speak with a man. And so the attorney on the case is also a lady, and she advised me of this and said, "Hey, obviously we can't have you go and talk to her." So I sent one of my investigators, April Meekum, who you've
Yeah.
met before.
Yep.
April's been with us for 14 or 15 years, and has just got an amazing way to relate to other women. And so she and two of my other female investigators have been working with this lady and going down and visiting her. But it's an inroad that I could never make. I needed women to be able
Yeah.
to talk to this lady because she was so ingrained and had Stockholm syndrome so bad against
Yeah.
any other man besides the one that she felt was the
Right.
prophet.
The 6'6" Justin is going to be a little bit daunting, maybe.
Right.
What
Exactly.
is she? You said you're defending her, and but she's a victim of polygamy. So what's if you can say what are you
Sure.
defending her for?
The crime is for transporting underage girls across state lines
Ah,
for
okay.
sex trafficking, which ends
So
up being
like
in the federal
other
system sex trafficking.
There's like
So
other
in
wives, other sister wives or something that she's
exactly,
yeah.
exactly. So these men have, I mean, sometimes dozens of wives, and they bring them from where they can get them.
Mm,
Some came from California, or they've been transported across state lines to hide them from law enforcement. So
wow.
when you transport someone for an underage girl for sexual
Yeah.
purposes, then it obviously runs afoul of many laws, including the federal laws.
I bet we could do well, that's your whole podcast is there's a million cases that are so interesting like that automatically just sort of is revolting to me. Like I don't know what she did, but she's a victim. So why are you going after someone? It's like low-hanging fruit, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but
Well, and
yeah, go ahead.
this is similar to a case that I had about 15 years ago. This was a it was the charge was sex trafficking through force, fraud, or coercion in federal court, and there was a pimp that was here in Phoenix, and he had put ads on Craigslist and brought in girls from other parts of the country to be his prostitutes. And so one of his other prostitutes, her name was April as well, coincidentally, no relation to the one that works for me, but she was what is known as the bottom bitch, which means the the top manager of the prostitutes under the pimp. And so she, in fact, was a victim. She had been trafficked herself. She had been traded to this pimp for, I believe, if I remember correctly, it was a purebred dog and like a bag of marijuana from her mother to a pimp.
Wow.
And
Wow.
so when I say that like our polygamous client is victimized, it's the same thing as this prostitute back 15 years ago. He was a victim that is just that is still living under this criminal enterprise and has now been utilized to facilitate the pimp's conspiracy of trafficking women.
Yeah.
So while she was committing a crime, she was also the victim of a crime.
Right.
So I got up and I
Right.
spoke at that was the first in fact that was the first mitigation presentation that I had ever done, and it was impromptu. I had her in federal court with Carmen, who you might remember,
Yeah.
and uh, she also had state charges. So I went to her state court sentencing after we had the federal charges dismissed, and the lawyer turned around during sentencing and said, "Hey, could you get up and talk about April's life?" And I said, well, sure, why not?
Nice.
And I hadn't prepared anything and never heard of mitigation before, and I gave a presentation on why I thought that April was victimized in her life.
Hmm.
So
And how'd it go?
she got 6 months for it was a lower level prostitution charge.
Yeah.
But in the Fed, she was facing it was either 15 or 25 years. I can't remember what
Yeah.
the mandatory minimum under the
Yeah, there's
sentencing guidelines were
mandatory.
at the time.
I've had some of those cases in federal court. And it's not
Mm-hmm.
just that these women are victimized, it's that the victimization is all consuming. I mean, body
Right.
and mind and soul. And I've had represented pimps before and I gotten my education and there's minds on pimps and there's hands on pimps. Those are the
Mm-hmm.
only two kind of pimps that exist. And both of them mean total domination.
Right.
And it's either a mental thing because you're that good that you can manipulate and coerce them and control them just by your words and you're in their head. It's called a minds on. And then you have your gorilla pimps, they call them, which are hands on, which is I'm going to beat you into submission.
Mm-hmm.
So they're victims of the highest order. And to say that they have full agency in their actions and full culpability when they're being completely controlled and manipulated by another human being, like, I don't even know why we're prosecuting those people in the first place.
I completely agree. And luckily, the main pimp, he went by the name of Milwaukee Mac, and
They
he
always
he
have great pimp
they,
names, don't they?
they,
I love the pimp names. I mean, it's a horrible thing. I'm not making light of pimps and prostitution, but they have great names.
they do, and it was an interesting case to kind of earn my bones on, but he had he had trafficked, he had brought in several girls that were on the upper echelons of his hierarchy of prostitutes. And each girl thought that they were in a relationship with him. They all considered him like their boyfriend or
Yeah.
significant other. And so what you say about the mind control, it's totally true. The they've been transformed into someone that thinks that this guy loves them, that he's going to take care of them, and he is taking care of them, and that they need to go and have sex and give over their money to him because they're all working together. When in fact he is using them and all of the girls that are under them, and getting a judge or a jury to understand that is super important because
Yeah.
the someone that is being criminalized as part of the charge that they're being charged for needs to be taken into consideration. You know,
Yes.
that is definitely mitigating. And you know, we had girls that were trying to get away, and you know, this Mac and others would say, you know, I've got your father in my crosshairs. If you leave, if you disappear, you know, I'm
Yeah.
going to shoot him. I know where he lives. They'll show pictures of him. They threatened them with frozen 2 liter bottles of water to beat them with. They they threatened to sodomize and violate them with curling irons. I
Yeah.
mean, so their ability to extricate themselves from an ongoing conspiracy was was just insurmountable. So the
Right.
argument of, well, why didn't you just walk away? Why don't you just leave? Why don't you just move to a
Yeah.
new apartment? Why don't you just buy a house in Gilbert? It just doesn't ring true because the
Right.
reality is they're prisoners and they're being abused as prisoners and they're being forced to continue the abuse to other people.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
anyways, I get very
Well, that
passionate
that
about
that
that.
that's no, that but that's a perfect example of why we do what we do. It's about understanding and context and building connection with the human experience because that's the
Right.
only time that you can start to discover the real truth.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not a coincidence, I think, that your podcast is Truth Be Found because people think defense lawyers are about manipulating the truth or trying to get it off on a technicality. There's so many deeper truths, and the real truth of our system is that the people who are involved in law enforcement, starting with the police, moving to the prosecutors, and ultimately the judges, are often very just concrete black and white thinkers. Well, the law says this, and you did this, so you get this punishment.
Mm-hmm.
And our job is not about the black and white. There are nuances, there are shades of gray in the
Mm-hmm.
human story, in the human truth, and our job is to take those gray areas and bring them into living color.
Exactly.
And that's what you do. And so I'm grateful. I'm grateful for you. And so I could keep going, and I love these stories. I'm probably just going to have you back because we didn't even talk about some of our most fun cases, but we did talk about them quite extensively on the first episode of Truth Be
Of
Found.
truth be
So
found,
if
we
you want to hear
did
a
definitely.
couple other really good stories about cases that we've worked on, including lugging a boulder out of Havasupai Canyon or defending our most favorite neo-Nazi client, all those stories are there. So I
Mm-hmm.
would say start with episode 1, but keep going because I know you've already released more episodes. And if anybody unfortunately requires the services of a great investigator, Justin Yentes can be found at azprivateinvestigator.com. I'm going to put links in the show notes to the podcast and your website and everything else. And we
I
will
appreciate that.
absolutely talk again. And
Definitely.
let me know if you find some Fortaleza or end up in Mexico at the distillery. I'm gonna
I
put
I
you in
wrote it
order.
down, and I've got plans to go to Mexico in the next couple of months on a couple of different things. So that will be
Okay,
on my list. And
but I have to give you one important tip though. If you're
okay.
in Mexico, this is not called Fortaleza.
Oh, really?
It's called Los Abuelos.
Okay.
Here's the story. It's always a story, but
Uh-huh.
this is from one of the oldest, most distinguished tequila making families in all of Mexico, and they started with the Salsa brand. We all know
Okay.
Salsa,
Yeah,
which right
exactly.
now is not worth the bottle it's blown in, right?
Hmm.
But that's because they sold out to a big conglomerate and mass produced, and that's the same story with Don Julio and all these things. But the Salsa family's tradition of being master tequila makers, the grandchildren wanted to honor that tradition and carry on. And there was one old rundown distillery left called Fortaleza, and they started the process again using the old school traditional methods in small artisan way. And that's Fortaleza, but it's called Los
Nice.
Abuelos. It's called Los Abuelos to honor the tradition of their grandparents,
The
who were
grandparents.
the really
Interesting.
but then the rub is the fucking lawyers because there's another brand of
Always.
alcohol, always. There's another brand of alcohol. It's rum that in the United States is called Abuelos or Los Abuelos. So there was a copyright infringement, and so they in the States they had to
Gotcha.
change the name to Fortaleza. So if you're in Mexico, don't look for Fortaleza, look for Los Abuelos.
Los Vuelos. Now, and I hope we're not taking this too long, and I'll make this quick. But this is my a few. There are very few options where, or times when I get to talk to a tequila expert.
Okay,
So I
good.
was
Let's
working.
go.
I was in Chihuahua several years ago, working for Tanya Peterson and Stacy
Uh-huh.
Hyder, who
Yeah.
would be fantastic guests on any show because they are brilliant legal minds
I've
and
worked with
just
them before. Yes, I love them.
incredible women. Um, but anyways, I was in Chihuahua and they introduced me to the locals to a local liquor called Sotol,
Uh-huh.
Sotol, and they said
Yeah.
it was like tequila but curated for Chihuahua and specialized in Chihuahua. And I picked up a bottle of it, and so maybe I'll next time I see you, I'll bring you that bottle
Okay.
because I'd like to get your your opinion. And I number one, I'd like to thank you for being our first guest on Truth Be Found. So I think a genuine bottle of Sotol would be good. But I'd love
Wow.
to hear your opinions on it and see what how it compares and contrasts to the tequilas that you're used to and
Yes.
that you
Oh,
like.
I would absolutely love to try that. And I haven't had Sotol. I've heard of it, but what I think it is a situation where, like I said, it can only be called tequila under certain conditions, and one of them is where it's made. And there's only 5 regions in Mexico, so it's possible that they're doing an agave spirit in a region that's not technically a tequila region. And the other possibility is if it's a different strain of the agave plant, because it
Okay,
has to be at least 51% of blue Weber agave to be called tequila. And
gotcha.
tequila is like, are you a whiskey guy? Do you drink
Yeah,
whiskey? Okay.
yeah,
So you know
bourbon.
how whiskey is the over umbrella term for grain-based spirits, but under the umbrella of whiskey, you have bourbon, you have scotch, you have
Hmm.
rye, right? That's the same thing for mezcal. Tequila is mezcal, just like bourbon is whiskey.
Hmm.
So mezcal is a generic name for anything distilled from agave.
That makes
And I
sense.
think Sotol is just another variation of an
Another
agave spirit.
variation. Okay,
So,
okay,
I'd love to try it. I haven't gotten
definitely.
into mezcals in general just because there's 30, 40 different strains of a agave plant, so the flavor range and everything is so varied that I can't. It's too much for me to absorb. With
Hmm.
tequila, I at least I feel like I can really kind of get the landscape and the notes and I'm starting to really, and the really good people, I'm not there yet, but they can take a sip of tequila and tell you where the agave was grown, whether it's in the
Wow.
highlands or the lowlands, based on the terroir. The soil is so important to the flavor of the spirit. But
No,
anyway,
I've heard
yeah.
of that. I'd be curious to meet someone whose palate is so refined to do that. But apparently they exist among us, and that's fascinating.
Jalisco
Jalisco. Okay.
Jalisco is where I think is where the Fortaleza distillery is gonna be
Okay.
Jalisco.
Okay.
So let me know
That's
if you're headed to
I
Jalisco anytime
I
soon.
am, unfortunately. Or fortunately,
Oh,
depending.
oh,
Yeah.
goody, goody. All right, well, we'll talk offline, but thanks so
Yeah,
much.
definitely.
All right, brother. Have a great weekend. I'll talk to you
Thank you,
soon.
Doug. Talk soon.
Thanks,
I appreciate
Justin.
it.
That's it for today, but before we go, I just wanted to take a moment and say thank you to you, the listener, for spending time with us today getting set for sentencing. Whether you're a lawyer, someone who could use the help, or maybe you're just a true crime buff who loves the inside scoop on how this whole thing works, I am so glad you're here, and I hope you keep listening. If you're interested in knowing more about what I do, mitigation videos, case consults, live teaching, on-demand educational content, books, articles, all of it, please visit www.dougpassenlaw.com. I'm Doug Passon. Until next time, hang in there. Wait a minute, that's a stupid way to sign off a podcast about sentencing. Hang in there. What's the matter with you, man? I guess they call that gallows humor. Sorry. All right. Well, I will see you next time on Set for Sentencing. Bye-bye.